Hello and welcome to what could well be the first in a kind of series of video essays, I suppose we could call them, from the Third Royal Centre team. And the idea of this is kind of that we're going to talk about some films that we like that maybe aren't particularly well known, or alternatively to kind of look at some well-known kind of classic films from ideally like a fresh perspective, trying to find something new or something that we found interesting that maybe hasn't kind of been done to death before. So we thought, kind of, what better place to start if you're going to do something like this than with that kind of cinematic behemoth that is Orson Welles' Citizen Kane from 1941. And it's a film that obviously lots of people have talked about in lots of different ways, but the way I'm going to look at it today, which is kind of ties into something that I'm interested in, which is kind of looking at and kind of talking about Citizen Kane and some of Orson Welles' wider work in relation to that kind of well, I suppose it is a cinematic genre, but also kind of this kind of mode of filmmaking which could be termed the mockumentary. So that is a fiction film that looks like a documentary. It's kind of delivered in the guise of a documentary. Obviously, you know, probably the most well-known versions of things like this is Spinal Tap and Christopher Guest's work and those kind of things. And not many people, I would have thought, would try and suggest that Citizen Kane, or indeed Orson Welles in general, was kind of a mockumentary filmmaker, or that, you know, Citizen Kane itself is a mockumentary. But I think there are things about it that are very important to the genre and that are kind of very interesting. And I think, I think the first of these is the fact that the film as a whole functions in a similar way to how kind of your classic idea of a mockumentary kind of works. And because it's kind of an early example, it doesn't do it in exactly the same kind of way. But it's interesting. So you have a journalist who is trying to find out some information about Kane, played by Orson Welles, and he goes, who's obviously who dies at the start of the film, and we kind of see his life through various flashbacks. But these flashbacks are very often initiated by recollections as the journalist is going around trying to uncover the secret of what Rosebud, which is Kane's final words, what that might mean. And so he sees his, former wives, ex-wives and ex-colleagues and things like that, and these set off these flashbacks. But a lot of these encounters are kind of framed as an interview. So it is a journalist interviewing like Joseph Cotton's character and people like that, with a camera in place.
Mr. Leland, what do you know about Rosebud?
Rosebud? Oh, his dying words. Rosebud. Yeah, I saw that in the Inquirer. Well, I never believed anything I saw in the Inquirer. Anything else? I can tell you about Emily.
Now, okay, the camera isn't. It's not supposed to be a documentary camera, and you don't. The camera isn't actually there. It's just the film camera that we're seeing, and the characters don't talk to the camera, so it isn't like they're being filmed for a documentary. They're just being interviewed by a journalist. However, that kind of setup of the kind of the question and answers with the camera in place, I think is very, very interesting, and it very definitely is something that later mockumentaries would develop. So that's the first thing. Another thing, and this is much more kind of key, is the 9-minute news on the march newsreel sequence that kind of happens very close to the start of the film. So the film opens with a kind of very stylized kind of high contrast image of Kane on his deathbed. You have him kind of murmuring Rosebud, his final words, and then the snow globe that he's holding as he dies rolls from his hand and shatters, and we see these great kind of stylized kind of canted angles through the snow globe, and it's very kind kind of oblique. It's very definitely not documentary. But then what happens as soon as we have this is that it cuts very sharply to a newsreel.
News on the march!
And there's a very definite change in style. What we do then, for the next 9 minutes, is learn about Kane's life and his history and his background and all of his achievements and his successes and his failures through a fake newsreel. And this newsreel is almost identical to the March of Time, or identical in style to the March of Time newsreels that would be very common in cinemas at the time.
Here on the deserts of the Gulf Coast, a private mountain was commissioned and successfully built. 100,000 trees, 20,000 tons of marble are the ingredients of Xanadu's mountain.
So it looks very like those. It's very definitely imitating something very specific, and something that is very specifically kind of a non-fiction format. And of course, what Welles does is he takes genuine documentary kind of stock footage from the archives, which is old and scratchy and grainy, and that's in there, so that looks like it's historical footage. And then he films new footage, which he makes, covers in scratches and grain, which is kind of fakes that age to stand alongside. And of course, then so the really old footage looks really old. It's really grainy, and even though it was probably only shot, a couple of weeks before or a couple of months before the edit, and then obviously the most recent stuff, so the thing that's supposed to show Kane's funeral, is kind of pristine in that sense that it's brand new, it's newly shot, and this newsreel is supposed to kind of connote that the nowness, the currentness, the presentness of Kane's death, in the same way that a cinematic newsreel would do to a cinema audience. So it doesn't just look like documentary, but it actually has the same function. For the characters within the film, it serves that nowness, and for us as film viewers, we're watching the fake newsreel in the same way as we would a normal newsreel, because it's telling us about Kane. Before this, we don't know anything about him, and so we're being informed via kind of a fake documentary about a fictional character. And actually what it does is it puts you as an audience, if you were watching this in the cinema in 1941, in exactly the same position that you probably would have been in maybe 10 minutes before, if you'd have seen, say, a March of Time newsreel in the supporting programme. And you're watching it in the same way. So I think it's interesting. I think this is kind of an interesting thing. But what is also interesting is the way that the newsreel and documentary is treated by Orson Welles throughout his career. Earlier, 3 years earlier, 1938, we have The War of the Worlds, the Mercury Theatre radio broadcast, which was broadcast on kind of Halloween in 1938, which presents itself again as a fake news broadcast. I mean, this time it's not a newsreel; it's a news flash. It's a kind of a performance of orchestral music is interrupted to deliver news that odd things are happening on Mars.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars.
And then the music comes back on, and then there's another interruption a minute later, and it escalates to the point where, it's revealed to be a full-on kind of Martian invasion. And I think what Orson Welles is doing in these two examples, both Citizen Kane's newsreel and in War of the Worlds, is he's treating the documentary and the news form in particular with a bit of scepticism, because what he's kind of saying is, this is where we get all our information. This is where we learn a lot of things. This is where world events are conveyed, whether it's through the radio broadcast or whether it's through the supporting feature at the cinema, and is kind of asking viewers and listeners to question them a little bit, to say, look, okay, yeah, it's what they're telling you isn't lies. Of course it's not. but maybe it's not entirely. Think about it. Think about how this is all put together, and so the idea of presenting something as non-fiction, kind of says, look how easy news is to fake, and I think that's kind of an interesting little thing, and it's interesting again if we look to the future, to a film called F for Fake, which Orson Welles makes in 1973, where he once again kind of the whole film's about issues of fakery and the fraudster, and Welles looks back to his own work, and particularly to the two instances of fake documentary that he's done earlier, War of the Worlds and the News on the March scene in Citizen Kane, and kind of asks you to question again not just the original news broadcasts on which these are based, but the veracity of the fake itself. And so for example, you hear, when he's talking about War of the Worlds, you don't hear the actual broadcast, you hear a recreation of the broadcast, and you see it, and it uses footage from Earth versus the Flying Saucers and things like that, so it's not represented directly, but it is passed off as if it's the actual broadcast. And Wells has a bit of fun with this and suggests that actually maybe it wasn't a fake to begin with, and that maybe there was a genuine, Martian invasion, which I think is quite interesting. But then the other thing is that he suggests that Citizen Kane was originally supposed to be about Howard Hughes and not William Randolph Hearst, as is commonly acknowledged to be the case. And that for various reasons he didn't do it about Hughes. But what he then does in F for Fake is recreate the Citizen Kane News on the March sequence for real about Howard Hughes. And so what you get is the News on the March fake title sequence, which we know is a fake newsreel. It's not the March of Time, it's News on the March. And this is followed by a series of newsreel footages of bits of footage of Howard Hughes.
This week, as it must to all aviation's pioneers, the great heart of a welcoming nation went out to handsome, well-heeled hero Howard Hughes.
And it kind of says, we kind of again asks us to think about what we're watching, because whilst it's presented as the reality of Hughes, the fact that it's a fake newsreel company throws that into question. And then, in the middle of all of these little images of Howard Hughes, there's a small clip of the film actor Don Amici, who looks a bit like Hughes. And it's in the middle of there, and again it's passed off as if this is genuine footage of Howard Hughes. And the question is, well, my question is, in that moment, is this a mistake? Is this a genuine mistake that, with all of these clips, a bit of Don Amici got in and they thought it was Hughes? Or is it, again, trying to throw a spanner in the works that you've been misled? If you don't notice that it's Don Amici, then you wouldn't question it. And then once you do notice, you kind of go, well, hang on, it's like, how real is the rest of this? And for somebody like Howard Hughes, who was kind of commonly thought to employ body doubles, so that he could kind of get about, so that, he was notoriously kind of, not shy, reclusive. And so getting people to imitate him to appear in public meant that he didn't have to go out there in public himself. And this idea, I think, of putting in a fake Hughes in the form of Don Amici in the middle of this little newsreel asks you to think about how real those other bits that are supposed to be actually Hughes are. Is Don Amici any more fake than the other ones, if those other ones might be doubles and impersonations? So that I think is interesting, and I think what Welles does throughout those three kind of films is to kind of say, look, here's the documentary form, it does certain things, and here's the newsreel thing, it does certain things, but don't feel like it's absolute truth, like it can get to the heart of everything, that there is such a thing as like an absolute truth. Think about things like, subjectivity, and think about how you as a person see things, and what you believe and what you think and feel, and don't take it as these things as read. And I think this is, returning to Kane finally, I think this is a very interesting thing, because the interesting one of the things about Citizen Kane is that Welles and Greg Toland, the cinematographer, worked really hard, and in fact everybody else in the production, but worked really hard to try and replicate the way that, like, the eye sees the world. So you get this deep focus photography, and you get ceiling sets, and there's a sense that it's creating a realism for this world that is grounded not just in documentary versions of record, but also like the human perception, the way we see things. And so what you have is you start with a newsreel, a documentary, which gives you a factual history of Kane, and it tells you about this person. But what it doesn't tell you, what it doesn't get to the heart of through factual material, is what Rosebud means, what that human element is, what those kind of what the feelings are, and what the thoughts are of this person. And it's almost as if Welles kind of says, look, documentary and news footage can't get to those things. You have to look elsewhere. And so the film is about trying to find this sort of thing. Of course, the problem is as well that the journalist is going around again using facts and figures and kind of asking for personal events and personal. But the one person that they can't ask is the one person that they're interested in, Kane. So the only person who knows what Rosebud is dead. And it's really interesting that what they find is that the characters within the drama, even using their own testimony and using facts and figures and documentary footage, can't get the answer. And what you end up having is that it's Greg Toland's kind of roaming, sweeping camera in that final shot that reveals what Rosebud is. And we, as an audience, learn, but specifically through that camera, which throughout the film is being set up to replicate the way that we see the world, as opposed to the way in which the documentary constructs the world through the newsreel. And so I think all the way through, even though he's using a fake documentary aesthetic, the use of that documentary style in that use of the march sequence is, for me, purely there to say, this is what documentary and this is what non-fiction, this is what newsreel can give you, but is it really everything that you want? And that it takes something else to get there. And that's all part of this whole project of kind of questioning and opening up non-fiction formats. But I think Welles is very important in this early stage of the mockumentary for questioning, for beginning to question, beginning to open up these issues.